Okay.
In fact, Jonathan Brown's book, I think towards the end, he does say, it's quite frank, I think something like 37% of hadith in a particular category, he says, are not trustworthy.
Oh, yeah.
I'm saying it boldly, but that's just the
fake
general
frauds. They're fraudulent. And this is true. And this is something that Muslim scholars have known from the beginning. This is not something that's happened 5 minutes ago. The last 1400 years. There's been a very sophisticated scholarly methodology developed way before biblical criticism developed in the West, when it went after the Bible and so on, to discern. It was well known in the early centuries there were fakes. There's an industry of fake hadiths which served ruling powers and sectarian interests. So scholars had to work out what do we do with these fakes. So they developed, as I say, a sophisticated critical method to discern what was fake and what was authentic. So it's always been known there have been fakes.
I know the hadiths, they give a sort of a so-called scientific background of the hadiths, but it's all baloney sometimes. When you look deeper into it, is that the word?
It's funny, yeah. When you deconstruct it, they love the word scientific.
Yeah.
It's all baloney, of course.
Yeah.
But it's pre-scientific for a start, anyway, historically.
Yeah.
And then it's actually non-scientific when you analyse it.
Yeah.
But they love that word scientific.
Yeah.
I did this like in social science.
Right.
Maybe social, but it's not science.
Yes.
So that's it. Just gives credibility.
Okay.
Superficially.
Well, I haven't really looked at their so-called hadiths, but what I do find is with some of the Muslims, as you hear in the debate, they kind of be loose with the what is sound and what is not sound.
In terms of hadith?
Yeah, they'll even say, even if somebody quotes, so like Christian Prince, they'll say it's a Sahih,
Yes.
Bukhari or Sahih.
Yes.
But yet, because it's detrimental to the Prophet's belief or something, they'll start looking to try and reject it. So it all depends on what the Muslim decides. He can accept a Sahih or not accept a Sahih. That's the way it seems to me.
In the individuals that ring up Christian Prince, then that's what they do, because that's what you hear. But I don't know because there are no debates between him and Islamic scholars. You don't know whether they would also like resile from the Sahih category in a tight spot, or otherwise. There's a chap. His name's on the tip of my tongue. But he actually effectively revises these categories for himself, because he thinks some of these hadith are, in his view, obviously not correct. Therefore, and he tries to look back at the chain of narration and say, well, this is why it can't be Sahih, although it was given that category all those years ago. But that's their business. That's their little issue to deal with and work through.
Yeah, but I just find it I'll probably look into it a bit more.
Can I just say something about that question?
You're welcome to.
Thank you. Classically, the Muslim scholars have debated even about the authenticity of Bukhari, the gold standard hadith collections, and many of them have said that about a handful of Bukhari hadiths are probably not authentic. It's not because of any pushback from Christians or anyone else, it's because Bukhari was just a guy who was not infallible, who, judged by the standard methodology of hadith criticism, made mistakes. So I think there's probably about half a dozen or so Bukhari hadiths that are not Sahih. But this is a debate that's been going on for many centuries. But I think because of colonialism, particularly Christian missionary encroachment on Muslim lands and colonialism, there's been a retrenchment. A lot of Muslims are very defensive about Bukhari, and like to think that all of Bukhari is 100% perfect all the time, and that's never been the ulama, the scholarly position. And it's not really for any Joe Muslim to say this is Sahih or not, because they're not qualified to do that. You've got to be a scholar to be able to make these judgments. You've got to be able to read Arabic, got to know all about the hadith sciences and so on. There's no one down here, down in Speaker's Corner, is qualified to do that. So it's not true to say that all Bukhari is perfectly true. No, that's not been the view of Muslim scholars ever in history. But there has been this kind of defensive posturing in the last couple of hundred years from many Muslims because of the attacks on Islam, and so a distorted impression has been given about Bukhari to many people. And I think, and you're reflecting that debate, I think, in the last couple of centuries. So you can say that this hadith in Bukhari is not authentic, but you've got to have the credentials to say that. You just can't be some duly speaker, I don't know you, but some Muslims can't say that. You've got to have the authority and the credentials to do that, and no, very few people have.
I think what I'm trying to get over, if I'm Catholic, I'm Christian, I engage with many Muslims.
You are now, by the way.
Oh, you're Muslim, okay, right, that's good. It might be a perception, but what appears to be is that if you bring a hadith, and it don't have to be Bukhari, it could be Muslim, and it's still Sahih. But if it even Sahih, but if it's not to that person's liking, or it's negative towards the say like the Prophet or the religion, their default is to challenge the same position rather than actually the science of it before. Do you understand what I'm trying to say?
Yeah, as I say, the people who do what you say are firstly not qualified to pronounce on these issues. I mean, any more than I like me as a non-doctor can go around diagnosing people's diseases and say, oh well, you should have this. No, you've got to be a doctor, you've got to be a specialist to be able to determine if it really isn't. Not on your likes and dislikes, but on whether or not it has a good isnad, a good matin, it passes all the very rigorous criteria for authenticity. That's the first question. And then only secondly, do you think, well, let's look at the issues in this. You don't decide it on your wins. I like this, I don't like that. That's not how responsible hadith scholarship has ever worked. But because we live in the age of social media and everyone can see anything, some Muslims feel they can just pronounce on these issues, and that's not, you can't do that any more than a lay Catholic can just pronounce on papal encyclicals on a whim. Oh, I don't like Veritatis Splendor. Well, yeah, John Paul II. Well, he was a bit crusty, wasn't he? And I don't like that. We're going to ignore Veritatis, which I've read by the way. I think it's a great encyclical. You can't do that. That's not how the Catholic Church works. It has a magisterium. It has papal authority. It has the status of encyclicals, etc., etc. So this is an issue. I'm not saying, by the way, that an individual hadith may be perceived as problematic. That's a separate issue. But the question of authority comes in. No more than you and I assume you're not cardinals, can pronounce on encyclicals. No more than Muslims, your lay Muslim, pronounce on the authenticity of Bukhari hadith. It's simply above our pay grade. But we can talk about whether or not we like the hadith personally, or I find this hadith problematic, or I find that papal encyclical Humanae Vitae. No, I don't like Humanae Vitae. We've moved on since then. Even though it is arguably infallible teaching according to many reputable scholars. I prefer that his teaching is infallible.
You could do well to get, say, Blackwell Companion to Hadith. There's another one, but I can't quite remember the name of it. These are very, give a nice comprehensive look at the issues, and I guess give what, for want of a better term, a kind of authoritative view of what.
I mean, Professor
People
Jonathan
view
Brown of Georgetown University is an expert on Hadith. His PhD was on that. He's written a very popular book in English, obviously, as an American guy, called an Introduction to Hadith. He happens to be Muslim, he's a Muslim as well. And this is a very respected academic introduction for the general public on this. So I recommend that if you want a good, solid introduction. But he's a Muslim as well as being a top Western academic on this issue. Is praised by professors at Oxford and so on. And I think the whole Hadith question, or Hadith criticism, is much more complex than many people realise, and much more subtle than many realise. But the rhetoric you're hearing and you're kind of articulating, as Jonathan Brown himself says, reflects a certain imbalance of power now in the world, where the Muslims are on the back foot very often, intellectually, culturally, economically, militarily, and there's a certain defensiveness in the Muslim response to criticism, which distorts the true picture, actually. So things aren't always as they seem on the surface, actually. So Jonathan Brown's book I would recommend highly. There are literally thousands, hundred thousands of good books on this subject. I've only read a handful.
In fact, Jonathan Brown's book, I think towards the end, he does say, it's quite frank, I think something like 37% of hadith in a particular category, he says, are not trustworthy.
Oh, yeah.
I'm saying it boldly, but that's just the
fake
general
frauds. They're fraudulent. And this is true. And this is something that Muslim scholars have known from the beginning. This is not something that happened 5 minutes ago. The last 1400 years. There's been a very sophisticated scholarly methodology developed way before biblical criticism developed in the West, when it went after the Bible and so on, to discern. It was well known in the early centuries they were fakes. There's an industry of fake hadiths which served ruling powers and sectarian interests. So scholars had to work out what do we do with these fakes. So they developed, as I say, a sophisticated critical method to discern what was fake and what was authentic. So it's always been known that there have been fakes.